The first thing that hit the alien commander wasn't the plasma fire, it was the smell. Commander Virex of the Tharx Dominion had fought on 7 worlds, subdued 12 different species, and was once wounded in the neck by a crystalline dart that melted through armor. But nothing prepared him for the moment the Terran prisoner opened a foil bag and released that pungent, acrid, nose-burning scent into the holding chamber. "What is that?" Virex staggered back, his translator chirping erratically as it tried to interpret the unclassified chemical stew assaulting his olfactory sensors. Callen slouched casually in the corner despite the bruises blooming across his ribs and the crusted blood on his jaw, looked up and raised the bag. "Spicy chips. Want one?" Virex didn't answer. He simply turned and left the chamber, his gait stiff, his breathing sharp. The 2 guards outside didn't dare ask why their superior looked like he'd walked through a sulfur storm. That moment would later be recorded as the first known exposure of a Tharx soldier to Inferno Crunch Max's Heat Level 5 chips. It would also mark the beginning of a sequence of events that would change the Tharx military doctrine forever. 3 days earlier, Isaac had been captured during the failed defense of Outpost 17 on Mars's southern pole. The outpost, barely a month old, had fallen within an hour under a surprise orbital barrage followed by ground troops with shimmering armor and weapons that carved through titanium like butter. Isaac had been one of the last to evacuate the engineering wing, dragging an unconscious medic and ducking under a collapsed support beam. A plasma burst had torn through his thigh as he reached the extraction shuttle. He didn't remember the moment he was pulled out, only the pain and the screaming of the engines as the shuttle lifted off without him. When he woke up, he was aboard a Tharx warship, his legs stitched with alien bio-gel and locked in a rigid brace. The pain was dulled but constant. He could barely walk and every movement sent a jolt up his spine. Still, he kept his mind sharp. He listened. He watched. He waited. The snacks were all he had left from his utility belt: 3 foil bags of spicy chips, a half-crushed protein bar, and a single wrapped cinnamon gum. He rationed them, not for nutrition, but out of stubbornness. They were his last pieces of home, and he wasn't going to give them up just because his captors didn't understand Earth food. Virex returned to the interrogation chamber the next day, this time wearing a rebreather mask. He stared at Isaac, who was now using the empty chip bag as a crude fan, wafting the scent toward the ceiling. "You will tell us how your species resists thermal plasma without armor," Virex said. Isaac squinted. "You're still on that. I told you I was lucky. The beam hit the floor next to me." "I got shrapnel. The wound geometry suggests otherwise." "You ever heard of bad aim?" Virex's eyes narrowed. He stepped forward and tossed a data slate onto the floor. "Your outpost had no shielding, no countermeasures. Yet your personnel fought until the last breath." Isaac shrugged, then winced at a stab of pain in his ribs. "We're stubborn or stupid. Depends on who you ask." Later that evening, one of the younger Tharx guards, curious and perhaps too bold, approached Isaac's cell and pointed at the second chip bag. "What is in that pouch?" he asked. Isaac tilted his head. "Heat, suffering, regret." The guard blinked his horizontal eyelids. "I wish to try." Isaac handed over the bag without ceremony. "Be my guest." The guard took a single chip, examined it, then popped it into his mouth. The reaction was immediate. His eyes bulged. His body stiffened. He let out a strangled gurgle and collapsed to the floor, clawing at his face. His tongue swelled visibly. His legs kicked spasmodically before he finally rolled onto his side, gasping through his gills. Isaac scooted back, alarmed. "Hey, I told you regret." 2 minutes later, medics arrived and hauled the guard away on a hover stretcher. The incident was logged as a Class 2 biochemical assault. From that moment forward, the chip bag was sealed in a containment locker labeled Hazardous Level 3. Virex summoned Isaac the next morning, his tone different, not angry, cautious. "What are those chips made of?" "Corn, oil. Some kind of pepper powder that probably violates Geneva Conventions." "Why do you consume them?" Because they taste good, Virex stared. You enjoy ingesting pain, Isaac smiled faintly. No, I enjoy the flavor. The pain's just part of the experience. The Tharx Council convened a special session. The footage of the guard's collapse spread rapidly across the fleet. New recruits were shown the video during orientation. It was dubbed the Fire Mouth Incident. Rumors grew. Some Tharks believed the chips were engineered bioweapons. Others claimed humans had developed internal fire sacs that allowed them to metabolize volatile compounds. Several units refused to approach human prisoners without full hazmat gear. It didn't stop there. When the Tharks attempted to board another human outpost on Ganymede, they found the entrances barricaded with booby traps made from crushed chip dust and compressed air canisters. When the doors blew, a cloud of fine red powder filled the air. 3 Tharx soldiers dropped instantly, convulsing. One lost his ability to speak for 2 days. Another tried to tear off his own armor. The outpost was empty. The humans had evacuated hours earlier, leaving only the trap and a handwritten note. Too hot, try milk. Virex personally reviewed the footage. He watched it 10 times, silent. Back in his quarters, he turned to his adjutant. These snacks, they are everywhere. Yes, Commander, the humans seem to carry them into every sector. Why? They claim it is for morale, but the effects are unpredictable. The Tharx Dominion issued a directive. All human foodstuffs were to be considered potentially hazardous. Contact was to be avoided without protective measures. Isaac, still recovering in the brig, was unaware of the growing panic he had sparked. His leg was healing slowly. The brace had been replaced with a walking support and he limped with effort, his muscles weak from disuse. One afternoon, a new guard arrived, taller, more decorated, clearly high-ranking. You are Isaac Callen, he said. Depends. Are you here to poke me, shock me, or ask about the chips? The guard did not respond. He set down a silver tray. On it was a single chip under a glass dome. We wish to understand. Isaac raised an eyebrow. You sure? The guard nodded. Isaac lifted the dome. The scent hit instantly. The guard flinched but stood firm. Isaac took the chip, chewed slowly, let the burn settle in. He closed his eyes. That, he said, is pain with purpose. The guard stared. You do not scream. You don't scream when you expect it. He placed the empty tray back down. The guard bowed and left. Virex received the report that evening. He read it twice, then set it aside. The humans had a weapon. The Tharks didn't understand, something intangible, something that couldn't be scanned or disarmed. They called it snacks. The explosion that tore through the port-side nutrient processing bay at third shift wasn't large enough to breach the hull, but it left a 20-meter section scorched, venting a mist of liquefied Tharx rations into the auxiliary corridors. The ship's internal sensors flagged it as a thermal overload, but Virex didn't believe in mechanical failures that coincided with human prisoners. The human, after all, was missing. The brig's security logs had been tampered with, overwritten by a recursive loop simulating 8 hours of stillness. No alarms, no movement. Yet the cell was empty and only 2 things remained behind: a bent eating utensil and the lid from a protein bar wrapper folded into a crude tool. Virex stood over the cell threshold, examining the wall panel that had been pried open. It was a maintenance hatch rarely used. In fact, it wasn't even listed on the standard navigation schema. He turned to the technician beside him, who stores out-of-date access corridors in their head, only someone with full engineering clearance or a death wish. Virex narrowed his eyes. Or both. Elsewhere in the ship, Isaac crouched inside an exhaust node shaft, breathing through clenched teeth. His leg brace had been jerry-rigged into a flexible splint using 2 snapped conduit rods and adhesive gel. Every few minutes, he paused to tighten the wrap. The pain hadn't faded, but he'd learned to count the rhythm of his heartbeat to pace his movement. He'd stolen a heat map scanner from a supply drone. It only showed energy signatures, but it was enough to avoid patrols. The Tharks had thermal-laced armor cores, which glowed like bonfires on the scanner. Their mistake was assuming that a limping human wouldn't last more than 100 meters in the sub-deck crawl space. Isaac had made it 6 kilometers. He hadn't eaten in a full day. What little hydration fluid he had left was split between drinking and keeping the brace from seizing up. He kept his mind busy by reciting old assembly routines from his training day's modular panel installations, oxygen seal tests, code fragments from interface consoles. It wasn't nostalgia. It was survival. At the same time, Virex held a meeting with the ship's internal security unit in the command dome. "He's injured," said the lieutenant, projecting a holographic model of the human's escape path. "We estimate his movement is limited to crawl spaces and ducts no wider than 70 centimeters. Virex didn't respond immediately. He was staring at a secondary feed and image from 2 hours ago. A storage unit had been opened and emptied, its contents scattered. Nothing valuable had been taken. Just 2 circuit boards, a cooling coil, and a pressure valve. Those components, what can they be used for? On their own, nothing significant. Together, maybe a heat exchanger, possibly part of a filtration system." Virex clenched his mandibles. "He's building something. Should we increase the anesthetic mist in the ducts? No, he'd just find the gaps. We can't risk contaminating the filtration system. Follow his trail. Set up thermal traps. I want him alive." 15 hours later, Isaac was in the waste reclamation unit, hunched over a disassembled coolant recycler. He'd bypassed the flow controls and rerouted a low-pressure vapor line into a makeshift distiller. It wasn't elegant, but he finally had water clean enough to drink. The first swallow made him gag, but the second went down easier. He leaned back against the paneling, letting the recycled warmth bleed into his spine. A soft click echoed through the corridor. Isaac froze. He switched off his scanner and pressed his ear to the vent wall. Nothing. Then another click, sharper this time, followed by a faint mechanical whir, tripwire. He rolled sideways just as the panel behind him hissed and ejected a burst of gel foam. It hardened on contact, sealing the vent shut. Had he still been sitting there, he'd have been fused to the wall. He didn't wait to see if more were coming. Dragging himself forward, he ducked into a side crawl space, using his elbows to propel himself. His leg caught on a loose bolt, and he bit down hard enough to draw blood rather than scream. 6 more meters. Then 11. Then a sharp drop. He slipped and landed awkwardly in a vertical shaft, the impact jarring his brace loose. Now he screamed. The sound bounced around the shaft, raw and guttural. He didn't stop until he passed out. When he woke, he wasn't alone. "You have 5 broken capillaries in your thigh and a dislocated fibula." Isaac blinked. The voice was clipped, synthetic, but the figure next to him was unmistakably Tharx, smaller than the others. Thin digits, matte armor, not a soldier, a medic. "You're not supposed to be here," Isaac croaked. "I was instructed to observe your physiology, not to assist, but you are compromising the ventilation grid." "You're helping me," the medic tilted its head. "No. I'm restoring environmental efficiency." Isaac watched as the creature applied a brace, not the crude one he'd built, but a proper support, fitted with biogel nodes and temperature regulation. It clicked into place with a hiss. "That's better," Isaac admitted. "Your species has an inefficient pain response. We call it motivation." The medic packed away its instruments. "You will be hunted again within the hour. You could lie and tell them you didn't find me. That would be an error." Isaac leaned forward. "You ever tasted lemon? No. Then you won't understand anything I do next." He reached into his jacket and pulled out the last item he'd been saving. Not food, not a weapon. A small foil packet marked electrolyte rehydration mix, citrus. He tore it open with his teeth, poured the powder into his mouth, and grimaced hard enough to make his eyes water. "Why did you do that?" asked the medic. Isaac wiped his mouth. "Because I needed to remember what it feels like to be alive." The medic remained still, then it left. 19 minutes later, Isaac was dragging himself into the starboard maintenance bay, now dark due to a rerouted power cycle. He'd memorized the timing. Every 90 minutes, the grid's diagnostic sweep reset for 30 seconds. That was his window. He used it to access the emergency beacon relay. The Tharx had disabled it, of course, but not thoroughly. They hadn't considered someone might try to reroute the signal through the ship's own coolant diagnostic pings. It took him 22 minutes to finish the override. When he pressed the final key, the console flickered once, then went dead. He didn't know if the signal had gone through. He didn't have time to check. The door behind him opened with a metallic sigh. Virex stood there, flanked by 2 guards, weaponless. "You've been busy." Isaac didn't move. "You're not going to shoot me?" "No." "I want to know why you didn't disable the life support when you had the chance." "You think that's what I was doing?" You accessed the coolant grid. "You could have vented the entire compartment." Isaac stared at him. "That's not how we win." "You sent a signal, maybe." Virex stepped closer. "You humans, you suffer injury, hunger, isolation, yet you continue." "Why?" Isaac coughed, the taste of lemon still in his mouth. "Because we don't have another option." Virex looked at the console, then at Isaac. "Take him back to the brig," he ordered. As the guards moved in, Isaac leaned against the wall and whispered, "Better hurry. Reinforcements tend to come when you least expect them." Virex said nothing. But a faint beeping in the console's core continued, unheard by all but the relay node miles away, quietly bouncing a signal into the black. 4 hours after Isaac's signal left the Tharx cruiser, the human ship Annapurna dropped out of folded space just beyond the Kuiper drift. From the cruiser's command dome, Virex observed the unexpected arrival with a quiet intensity. The Annapurna was smaller than the Dominion's dreadnought, but its hull shimmered with irregular plating scavenged, repurposed, layered like armor grown from necessity rather than design. It didn't match any previous configurations cataloged from Earth's fleet. No orders had been issued. No demands transmitted. The Annapurna simply hovered 2,000 kilometers off the cruiser's port side, inert and watching. At the same moment, in a dimmed medbay-turned holding room, Isaac lay strapped to a restraint cot with a fresh adhesive mesh binding his ribs. His hands were cuffed to the side rails. A faint antiseptic haze floated in the air, tinged with something vaguely metallic. A new figure stood over him, a Tharx technician with a surgical harness and a data probe embedded in its chest. It hadn't spoken, but it had scanned him 3 times. "I've got a cracked scapula, 2 fractured ribs, and something's pinching the sciatic nerve," Isaac said, voice hoarse. "You want to help, or just keep waving your scanner like it owes you money?" The technician paused, then extended a slender filament from its harness and inserted it into a port on the restraint cot. A pulse of blue light swept over Isaac's chest. "You're metabolizing pain inhibitors faster than expected. This suggests your liver is operating under non-standard enzymatic conditions." "Guess I'm not textbook." The technician retracted the filament. "Your species' resilience is excessive. Thanks." "We try." "Unnecessary," the technician replied and turned away. 2 hours later, Virex entered the chamber. "You signaled your fleet," they answered. Isaac raised his head. "Did they bring snacks?" Virex ignored the jab. "They are not engaging, no transmissions. No active scans. They're waiting. For what? For me to finish what I started." Virex stepped closer. "You had several chances to sabotage this vessel. You didn't. You disabled no systems. You harmed no crew." "I didn't come here to destroy anything." "Then why?" Isaac exhaled slowly. "To see if you'd notice the difference." Virex looked down at the restraints. "Your limbs are damaged, yet you moved through 64 access points in less than 2 days. You constructed filtration systems, rerouted power, and transmitted a coded signal using a coolant diagnostic loop. You're welcome. Why not surrender? Because you'd ask the wrong questions." Silence passed between them, then Virex tapped his comms. "Bring him to the main bay." The guards didn't speak as they uncuffed Isaac and lifted him into a hover carriage. They moved briskly through the corridor, past observation decks and sealed bulkheads, until they entered the forward hangar, the only space large enough to see the Annapurna in full. It hovered in silence, its surface reflecting streaks of interstellar ice and fractured light from the cruiser's exterior lamps. No hailing signal, no visible crew. Virex motioned toward the observation barrier. Look at it. That hull is patched with components from 10 different systems. Some of them centuries old. Your kind builds ships like nests, not like machines. Isaac leaned forward on the railing, his legs trembling from the effort. That ship used to be a mining barge. The crew rebuilt it in orbit after it got hit by a rogue asteroid. They didn't wait for rescue. Just welded it back together with whatever they had. They trust you enough to risk entering Dominion space without weapons active. They know I wouldn't call unless it mattered. Virex studied him. Why do they care so much? Isaac didn't answer immediately. He flexed his fingers, still raw from crawling through ductwork. Because all we've got out here is each other. Virex turned away from the window. You've proven your point, which was that your species survives not because of strength or strategy but because retreat is not in your nature. Isaac tilted his head. That's not quite it. We survive because we understand failure. We don't fear it. We walk through it. A pause. Then Virex tapped the comms again. Open channel to the human vessel. The technician at the console hesitated. Standard encryption. No encryption, no codes, just speak. A beat of static, then a voice crackled through the receiver. This is Captain Ravas Singh of the Annapurna. We're here for our engineer. Virex didn't blink. He is unharmed. He trespassed aboard our vessel. He disrupted operations. However, he inflicted no casualties and caused no structural damage. Then we'll take him off your hands. And if I refuse, I doubt you will, the channel cut. Isaac looked over. She's good at brevity. Virex nodded once. There is no honor in detaining one who came only to endure. Are you saying you're letting me go? I am saying I have no further need to understand you. 30 minutes later, Isaac stood at the airlock threshold. His legs were braced, his arms wrapped in a thermal cloak provided by one of the guards without comment. The corridor was quiet. Virex stood opposite him. You risked your life to send a message. What was it? Isaac glanced at the docking clamps, disengaging with a hiss. That we're not afraid of getting close. The door slid open. A boarding ramp extended from the Annapurna and 2 human crew members stepped forward, each carrying a support rig. Isaac turned once more. You ever want to try lemon, let me know. Virex gave no answer. Within 10 minutes, the Annapurna pulled away from the Tharx cruiser and vanished into folded space without a trace. Back aboard the Dominion vessel, the technician who had tended to Isaac approached Virex after the departure. Should we update the behavioral files on Terran prisoners? Virex stared into the empty space beyond the viewport. No. Let them remain classified as unpredictable. 3 days later, Isaac sat in the Annapurna-S recovery bay, drinking tepid broth through a straw while a medbot adjusted the pressure on his leg. The pain was dull now, manageable. The kind that reminded you you'd lived through something you weren't supposed to. Captain Singh entered, holding a datapad. You're lucky. I'm stubborn. She nodded, then handed him the pad. Command wants a report. They think you pulled off a recon op. I didn't even have a radio. They don't care. They're calling it adaptive infiltration, Isaac sighed. Of course they are. You want me to write it up for you? He shook his head. No, I'll tell them everything. Singh raised an eyebrow. Everything? Isaac looked out the window where the stars had no edges, no borders, just endless motion, from the chips to the lemon. She smiled faintly. You're going to confuse the entire diplomatic corps. Good. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and let the silence settle. There was nothing more left to prove.